everyone. My name is Nora Almeida. I'm from the New York City College of Technology, part of CUNY. I think I'll let the panelists introduce themselves as we go, just in the interest of time. And I know it's early, but we wanted to start by asking for some contributions from y'all, and you can just shout these out instead of passing a microphone. But we wanted to start by talking a little bit about language and either capitalist metaphors or language that you have used in conversations with colleagues or administrators or patrons in your library, whether in the context of information literacy, which is the topic that we're going to talk about, or in other kinds of conversations. So does anyone have a burning example of capitalist jargon or I'm sorry? Customer service, yeah. And I know we talked about the idea of consumers yesterday. That came up in Barbara Pfister's talk. Any others?
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand. At the end of the day. I was thinking of a lot last night too. Buy-in, right? Everyone's like buy-in. What others?
Demonstrating value.
Demonstrating value. Return on investment.
Stakeholders.
Oh, stakeholders. Yes. Incentivize. Any other?
Has value.
Huh?
Information has value.
Yes, indeed.
Productivity,
yeah. Cool. Well, I mean, those are some really great examples to start us off. So I wanted to kind of start here because when I initially saw the CFP for the symposium and thought about what I was going to talk about and kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the language and rhetorical history of information literacy, the thing that I initially thought of was a metaphor that I use in almost every single one-shot that I teach. So after asking students if they've ever encountered content that they had to pay for online, a paywall, which everyone has, it's a relatable example, I typically say something like the library subscribes to academic databases in the same way that you might subscribe to cable TV, or Netflix now, as that's become sort of the media du jour. And this metaphor, I think, acknowledges that information, like television, is a commodity implicitly. And I wonder if this metaphor positions students then as consumers. Does it simplify knowledge production environments or obscure some of the labor behind that? Does it reinforce neoliberal ideologies just by bringing this metaphor kind of to the front? So this is kind of one of the questions that I initially was trying to grapple with when thinking about this presentation. And ultimately, I think this metaphor is kind of helpful in that it does communicate how knowledge economies work. We just heard about that a little bit. And how library subscriptions work in a way that students understand. But I think the problem is that after I introduce a metaphor like this, I don't have time or the space to really unpack some of the problems with information commodification or access disparities or Western-centric publishing models or the monetization of user behavior or corporate surveillance or even the burden of subscription database costs on our institutions. So I wonder, can we address these kinds of issues without legitimizing them? And is this critique really the goal of information literacy in the first place? And how does this relate to the goal of information literacy? Which brings me to really what I want to look at for the next few minutes to get at the goal of information literacy. I want to look at two texts very briefly that I think are important in the development of information literacy as a rhetorical concept. The first is a 1974 paper in which the term information literacy was first coined. It was by Paul Zurkowski, who was then president of the American Information Industry Association. And his report was called The Information Service Environment, Relationship and Priorities. And the second text is the 1989 ALA Presidential Committee on Information Literacy final report, which some of us may be familiar with. So these documents are not a comprehensive canon of IL history at all, but I do think that they are important in illustrating how information literacy as an idea was initially framed and then later institutionalized in the profession of librarianship. So starting with the Zurkowski text, which is about relationship and priorities. So the relationship that's explored here is one between industry and libraries very explicitly. He also talks very much about the role of government and policy and regulation in sort of defining how this relationship works. The priority espoused by the report is to, quote, establish a major national program to achieve universal information literacy by 1984. to train all citizens in the use of information tools. And it really frames information value in the context of capitalist markets, maybe not the first text to do so, but an important sort of frame. And it also frames libraries and information industries directly as competitors. And that's really what the bulk of the report talks about. The information landscape has obviously changed. There's a lot of talk about photocopying, for example. But there's some things that I think are still sort of pervasive now. So Zurkowsky directly uses free speech as an argument, as rationale for proposed government policies that limit the capacity of libraries to compete with commercial publishers. He even includes a page-long excerpt from the US Constitution on free speech as part of the rationale in this document, and basically proposes that libraries redefine their role and take on information literacy training and as part of this national initiative to train everyone by 1984, while information service environments should be outsourced entirely to the free market. One of the central tenets that's repeated throughout this text is, quote, governments should not perform services for its citizens which the citizens are capable of performing for themselves. And this idea kind of results in policy recommendations which would create competition among what he calls products delivering concepts and ideas. So free market equated with free expression very directly here. It would also obviously create more sales for information vendors, which is his priority as his position was in that sector. It would create more tax revenue. And so to sell this to the government, he also talks about how it would be more cost effective for governments since it would distribute the cost of information to consumers rather than taxpayers having to subsidize it through libraries. And here's a couple of quotes from that text. Okay, so moving forward a little bit in time, the ALA Presidential Committee on Information Literacy final report. So there's two real explicit goals in this report. The first tries to outline the role of libraries in preparing people to compete in, quote, an information society. And the second is probably not surprising to any of us. It tries to address the marginalization of libraries from literature that has preceded it about the information society and why libraries have been kind of left out of that conversation. This document certainly, among other documents, influenced the ACRL standards, now the framework. An obvious difference from the Zurkowsky test is that it frames libraries in a more positive light as, quote, one of the few safeguards against information control by a minority, where Zurkowsky makes the opposite point. But like the Zurkowsky text, it frames liberty and advancement using the language of business. It focuses on individuals over collective good. It touts the real competitive advantage of information literacy that kind of underpins a lot of the rationale behind it. And it really defines the value of education and libraries in terms of capital, return on investment, right? I think that was one of the metaphors that came up. And it proposes really a reconceptualization similar to the way that Zurkowsky sees a reconceptualization of libraries in the wake of free market ideology as, information literacy trainers, right? Some of these quotes up here are really juicy, so you can read those. The report also obscures systemic social economic problems, and a lot of people have critiqued the report for this, by claiming that information literacy alone has the potential to fix, quote, long-standing social and economic inequities. And it basically implicates those who are already empowered in stratified economic systems. It claims also, in a kind of a strange way, that the main impediment to information literacy is lack of information literacy about information literacy. Right, so Maura Steele has a really great critique of this report in a book chapter called The Neoliberal Library, which I'd encourage you all to check out. Ian Bellion also has a really good critique of this in his Student Success article, Critique of Success. And she talks about this idea in her chapter that information literacy in this way, in that it's, the lack of information literacy is the problem with no one being information literate. It's really divorced from critical theory and education disciplines. It just puts it in this kind of echo chamber that she calls a closed system. And she argues that this closed system has really limited the critical potential of educators to use information literacy in the way that it might be used. And it's also really insulated information literacy as a concept against critique. So a lot of the proponents of critical information literacy, a lot of people in this room are probably among them, have made it really a project, their project to redefine information literacy and kind of open it up to critique, especially by infusing it with some of these other disciplines. And so we'll talk about some of the strategies to do that later in the presentation. I'm gonna hand it off here.
Okay, is this on?
Just speak into it.
Okay. All right, so my name is Romel Espinel. I'm the Web Services Librarian from Stevens Institute of Technology across the river in Hoboken. Am I on? Okay. All right, so just a little explanation about my headline. I'm doing another paper on Frankenstein in libraries, and so I felt the liberty of taking a leash from that. But I felt really uncomfortable this week because I felt like it was incomplete. And so this week, as I was listening to Kendrick Lamar a lot, I figured out the second part about that, which is what's in our DNA. So neoliberalism unleashed, what's in our DNA. Because what I really wanted to talk about was just kind of about how we need to be reflective about where our practice in information literacy comes from, and a lot of it can be embedded in neoliberalism and stuff like that. So that's mainly what I wanted to talk about. So over the past 40 years, neoliberalism has crept into all aspects of our lives. I remember when I started, when I got out of library school, it was probably around 2008, 2009. It was a great time to be a librarian. There was a lot of people at Pratt Sills, if anyone was there, because everything had changed. A lot of things have changed with the landscape had changed. Information technology had drastically changed how students and people in general obtained information. Well, on the one hand, the promise of the internet was that we would have access to all the information we want. On the other hand, varying and competing for-profit formats and content production made for the environment that was open for harvesting profit from consumers and from everyone. Because of the falling rate of profit and the need to continually compete in the world capitalist market, we can see over the past 40 years, neoliberalism has crept into all aspects of our society. We can see the privatization of public services, education, social services, prisons, corporatization of social relationships in business and personal. How many things do we have to see where people actually use business, business models or market models to talk about even intimate relationships, free trade and the belief that we're better off from a globalized world where we are all connected. I think we're all connected to buy and sell. That's really what they mean. And lastly, increasing competition between everyone. Aided by unending wars, globalization, global warming, and shortages of resources, there's a consolidation of power and capital. There's falling wages all over the world. There's diminishing power of unions and workers' movements. And I think this is probably one of the biggest aspects of what's gone on in the last 40 or 50 years is that, there's not a very powerful left movement. Hopefully there will be in the future. And there's the dismantling of the welfare state. And those are all aspects of what neoliberalism is and encompasses that. I think Dave gave a great examples and description and critique of that. So when I became a librarian, a big thing in 2009 was that Obama declared October National Information Literacy Month, which it was kind of important because it kind of validated kind of our profession, that what we were doing was important, at least from my perspective, and that's where I was coming from. And hopefully that we were doing something that was necessary would hopefully change librarian profession's perception, where we could be viewed as real educators. But if we go back to Obama's declaration, and neoliberalism was embedded in our best efforts, so I went back to it and really looked at it, and I was just like, oh my God. It's in there. It's all in there. It's all neoliberalism that speaks. So one of the things that he talks about is the importance of information literacy, because there's this crisis of authenticity. This reminds me of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, that like capitalists are really trying to re-engineer society and trying to reconstruct it based upon there always is a crisis. So if you looked at New Orleans and saw that after the hurricane Katrina, it was destroyed, and so then afterwards they rebuilt the education system, and it's horrible, and it's privatized. He also talks about competencies, and competencies is about learning the new technology. And while Obama administration was making proclamations, the onus was on the individual of taking advantage of the information themselves and not on the society. He also talks about informed citizenry, but it changed from the Jeffersonian informed citizen. Informed citizen meant the informed consumer, I thought, in what he was talking about. It was really about how we were consuming information and how we were evaluating it. So I think that was one of the big things that I took out of reading that, and it was all up. So these are some of the things that were hopefully we try to get out of our information literacy classes. A lot of times we know that's not correct. There's sometimes if we're not being critiquing our information literacy practice, we might be seeing these practices of neoliberalism, like tracking, outsourcing, individualization, practices of data for the surveillance state, and sowing more class and race and sex divisions. So that was just kind of blazing through it, and I had to quote Fugazi because never mind what we're selling, it's what you're buying. It's just a critique of what we're doing in our own practice. Okay.
Okay. Hi everybody. My name's Eamon. I'm a reference and instruction librarian at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York, home of the Blackbirds. And, thank you. And I'll be talking about how capitalism shapes the practice of information literacy in academic libraries specifically, and how we can see the influence of capitalism's demands for efficiency, for consumption, for producing certain types of knowledge on our work as educators in libraries. So to start out, I want to make the point that the commodification of information, which is a very large issue, it's been under discussion here at the symposium, is something that should be recognized as intertwined with the commodification of information literacy, as intertwined with the commodification of higher education. So these aren't issues that we can really separate from one another, and I don't think we should even try to. So it is a lot of commodification going on, right? But it's what we face, and it's happening on many different levels. And we can't separate that demand to kind of prove our value, which comes up so often in libraries now, from our precarious working conditions, from promoting information literacy as the answer to fake news or the answer to workplace competencies, things like that. And we can't ignore the broader things happening in higher education, like shift towards market-driven majors and programs, like the extreme reliance on and overburdening of adjunct faculty and workers, and attacks on organized labor that has come up a couple of times already today. That's happening both on the levels of our workplaces and our governmental administrations. So it's within this very happy environment that I'll be talking about information literacy more specifically. So as was mentioned earlier in the panel, information literacy has remained really an unquestioned dimension of library work for a long time, up until recently. And in truth, it has and continues to reflect and reproduce these hegemonic orders, which certainly includes that of capitalism. As Kathy Eisenhower and Dulcie Smith point out here, we have a discourse of information literacy as a knowledge that results in autonomy. It hints at liberation, it hints at kind of critical thinking, it's something that will set you free. Well, in reality, that's quite a leap, right? Even if we accept that premise, it's the critical thinking that's happening within the confines and the logic of information's complete commodification. So to that end, I want to consider a couple examples of what information literacy performs in academic libraries, what work it does, and what work librarians do in its name. Right? So, that brings us to the one-shot session, which, as I see it, is kind of the preeminent form of capitalist information literacy education. I'm already seeing some head nods. So it's like, who here has heard of a one-shot session? Yeah, a good number. Okay, good. So I won't get too into what that entails. So the one-shot session, you have about 50 minutes to teach a class all about the library to students, a class of students. 75 minutes if you're lucky, right? And that time span is usually all the academic librarians have to work with students in classroom setting. So Karen Nicholson observes that the one-shot is all about time, whether that's negotiating with faculty for additional time, whether that's managing the time that you do have to provide the best learning opportunities, whether it's trying to stretch time that you have through out-of-class assignments or through kind of flipped classrooms, things like that. So it is reflective of corporate time, under which Nicholson states the tempo of teaching, learning, and research becomes accelerated and fragmented, leaving little time for deep learning, critical thinking, reflection, or writing. The classes are already limited in their success because they rely on effective collaboration with faculty, and these faculty are already stretched thin or contingent themselves, right? Well, facing a lot of problems here. There are a lot of other types of teaching within the library. Of course, there's a reference desk, beloved reference desk. There's just informal learning opportunities with students. But the one-shot is significant to me because it really tells us what information literacy is vis-a-vis capitalism. It's a matter of learning the right tool to use. It's all about harvesting peer-reviewed articles from a database. And most of all, students become information literate within the course of an hour so they can return to their actual class content. So, provide one more brief example. Within the one-shot session, and in no small part due to the limited amount of time that we have, there's a tendency to focus on databases to the detriment of teaching pretty much everything else about the library and information, about how those things work. And this happens for all sorts of reasons. Again, it's less demanding for us as teachers who are already pressed for time. Students often just need their peer-reviewed journal articles. Instructors maybe don't even know that we can teach about more than just databases, right? But I think the larger issue that we face here is kind of replicating that of the scholarly status quo. We don't have time to question it, and so it goes unquestioned. We basically, in a 50-minute class, it's difficult at best to kind of challenge the premises of scholarly communication while also teaching how to use these same tools. So the prevalence of the one-shot and an over-reliance on database instruction are not so much pedagogical problems, or I think even problems of time. Information literacy education reflects the maximum extraction of value from workers, and it reflects capital's imperative for efficient and frictionless transactions. Right? The structural violence of capitalism is what prompts people to develop their information literacy skills, to make sure that they're lifelong learners and continue to learn and continue to gain the skills. It's also what compels us to improve the value of the library, and this happens at the risk of students' privacy, as we're seeing now with the use of learning analytics and tying library use to student performance measures. So to wrap up, information literacy education under capitalism, to me, is an issue of power and an issue of labor. We have some strong support structures within the library, and they need to be strengthened, right? Absolutely. That way, we can meaningfully determine what work we do and how we do that work. I don't have any immediate answers, but to me, this means paradoxically doing more work, which great, right? Sounds good. Sign me up. And operating on different levels as we perform that work. That means participating in assessment, demonstrating our value, and so on, while finding and making the most of opportunities to push back against some of these same things. Okay.
Thanks. So I'm Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe. I'm the coordinator for information literacy services and instruction at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Yes, it's a whole agenda item just to say all that. I am going to cap off our panel here with sort of telling a story, I think, about my struggle to find sort of a position within the tensions and structures that have already been discussed, and some of the things that I do, which will then kick us off into hopefully some discussion about other things that people do. Because one of the things that is really foremost in my mind is, as much as I would like to have our students be sort of freed of the economic structures in which they are living their lives, they aren't. As this says, they need a job. And they're going to college in many cases for that purpose. If you are familiar with this study, The American Freshman, and nicely this is an open publication at the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, they've been running a national survey of the college freshmen for over 50 years at this point. And so we have amazing trend data. And if you see those Time Magazine and Newsweek articles every year that's like, the freshmen are more liberal, they're having more sex, they smoke less, like this is that survey, okay? In this survey, they ask a question of what are the following reasons that it's very important to go to college? Now, one of the things I want to point out is they actually changed the responses over time that students can choose. So early on, there was like, my parents wanted me to go. Apparently, they've stopped asking that. And part of the reason that happens is when no one's clicking that anymore, like it's not a data point. So they put in other things. So what we can see is that to get a better job is the top rated reason that students indicate it is very important to go to college. Now, they are smart, actually, with this, because in reality, that on average, having a college degree sets you up better. But I do want to point out some other things here, and if you know this book, Arthur Levine was sort of the architect of some of this original research, and he wrote this awesome book in the mid-90s, which actually was very inspiring for me as I was starting my information literacy career, as I was filling in the 1980s history for some of you on Twitter earlier, that he wrote this book called When Hope and Fear Collide. And it was about the fact that what they were seeing in this survey is incredible hope from students for their future, but fear, and how they negotiated this. So what I'd like to point out is that to gain a general education and appreciation of ideas also gets 72%. And to learn more about things that interest me gets 82.4%. And to get a better job is only at 85.2%. So in reality, students are recognizing and coming to us with dual roles and dual purposes. So I think there's a lot of good there, right? Like they are able to find their positionality in college amongst those two priorities, getting educated and getting a job. It doesn't have to be either or. In addition, we see that they actually share, students and employers, a view of the importance of information literacy for career success. So this is admittedly not the most important thing from the perspective of either students or employers, but they actually share a pretty shared perspective on how important this particular learning outcome is in college. So one of the things that I take from this is actually a little bit of heart, which is, first of all, that they want to get a job, but they also see the value of education more generally. And they actually see the value of things that we are doing with them in the library. And one of the things I think we can take from that is to remove ourselves from the position of sometimes apologizing for the fact that they have to come to information literacy instruction. And if we started to presume and assume that they wanted to be there, it would be very powerful for them. In addition, we have to admit that many of them are actually studying to be capitalists. The greatest number of degrees conferred is in business. And most of them are not going in there to do nonprofit, okay? But also these other fields of health professions and the like, they very much are studying to do this. So for me, I think choosing to navigate this tension has meant to resist the temptation of neutrality. I think it's very easy to sort of say, oh, but librarians are neutral, we'll just sort of step back and let everything play out, and to instead accept the obligation of our positionality here. In particular, we can say that we choose how we frame our information literacy instruction and the examples that we choose.
So citing myself, which may or may not be good practice, there's a chapter, and it's available in our institutional repository at the University of Illinois, called Loading Examples to Further Human Rights Education, but you can swap out diversity or any sort of critical perspective that you want, where I talk about how the examples we choose in our one-shot convey messages, and we could choose different examples, but admittedly we have to do this in the context of the one-shot session and not do violence to the curriculum that we're teaching within. So there's so many more things that we could talk about, but we want to make sure that we all have a chance to chat, and so who am I turning the mic over to?
Well,
Am I doing this? Wasn't my slide. So we have a chance for a conversation, as well as there's a shared doc if you'd like to log in and take a look at some of the ideas that we've seeded already with the ways that we can do critical resistance, particularly within the one shot, but we'd also like to hear your questions or comments now.
Yeah, so we can talk about some of this stuff, or if people have questions, we can pull up. We have a pirate pad here where people can anonymously contribute ideas for resisting, and we could talk about those now too, or if people have questions.
First of all, thank you for a very inspiring session. I do information literacy, but I'm an archivist, so I don't use databases. I use actually our university's own marketing materials to teach information literacy. And I often feel like if we take it to its logical extreme, if our students are truly information literate, they would not be enrolled in our university. I'm wondering, like, do you guys ever reflect on kind of like your own obsolescence? Did that make sense? Because I think about mine.
yeah.
So one thing I would so no actually is my answer. So from the perspective, because I think that if we could ever get out of teaching databases and navigating authentication systems, it'd be amazing what we could spend our time teaching. It would actually probably be more what students are actually interested in. But I would really encourage you, if you have this, to go read an article from the 1980s by Michael Gorman. I realize some of you will not love that, but it's called Send for the Child of Four. And it's a vision of the, what was then called BI, Bibliographic and vision of the BI-less library, in which he posits that if only we had better signage, students would not need library instruction, because he was actually very against library instruction becoming a library service. Now, it's ironic for me because I'm the coordinator of the Infolit at the library he was the director of when he wrote that article. I can tell you signage is not the answer.
I guess, I mean, I definitely feel that some of our students push back against like the requiredness of the instruction. And like, I know that Romel and I both teach at tech schools. And I think some of the problems are how the sessions are positioned by the faculty and also within our curriculum. Like, I feel like it would be in some ways more effective if we didn't always get sort of lumped in with gen ed, because mostly we see students in a class that they're required to take that's not related to what they actually want to learn. And so I feel like their engagement is sometimes reflects that, and the faculty engagement sometimes reflect that. So I feel like there are opportunities maybe to sort of think about the not just the way that we're approaching things in the classroom, but also of like maybe more like better ways to sort of have conversations in our universities with how these programs are implemented and structured too.
I guess I see the obsolescence if we just do what the faculty want us to do. Because that's what, Giroux talks about, like micro objectives, which is just basically what you do in the classroom and what the learning objectives are there for. Where, where our importance, I guess, is about the macro objectives. So how do we teach them to understand the world larger than the classroom or outside the university, and how to show them to expose contradictions of capitalism. And I think that's where it's really important, and actually that's when usually students' ears start perking up and are just like, wow, this is more about things outside the classroom and making it more personal to them. So I think they see the importance then, because if we're just going, like, I'm so tired of demonstrating that databases, I just don't do it anymore. I mean, that's what they have user experience people doing. I'm not there to, demonstrate the databases and stuff like that. So if we're talking about issues, and then I think people get more engaged.
Hi, so I work in a public library, and I was tasked in 2016 at the end of the year, in November, December, and then into 2017 with doing information literacy workshops for the public, but I wasn't allowed to use the words information literacy. And so they were called fake news workshops and, navigating the world of fake and real news and all that. And it was interesting how the opportunity really did come up once we started with these members of the public. Once we started critically thinking about our information sources, how a critical discussion about capitalism came right behind it. So it wasn't even there was some like trepidation from certain people about like, oh, is this going to be partisan or political or something, and it didn't even. It went there on its own once people started thinking about these things. And I hope there's a better term than information literacy out there someday. But
We have time for one more, and then we'll get some reactions and wrap up. I just wanted to second that. We don't need to teach databases because A, they're boring, and B, students will figure it out. So they tune out, of course. I mean, I would too. So why do we do that? I think we do it because the faculty bring us in to talk about something they don't actually understand themselves or they don't feel comfortable about because they don't do research like novices do. But novices don't need a database demonstration, and they are going to be a lot more engaged if we can get past, you'll get this. Here's where it is. Let's talk about this other stuff and it's so much more interesting. So yeah, I came to this after the long, bitter discovery that when I did explain a database, they were just tuning it out. So then you're just like, now let's use it. Like, well, wait, how does what? I mean, where? I mean, everything I had said was obviously not sinking in. So like, why spend that time? They'll figure it out, or they'll ask for help when they need it. So.
So that's a problem I come up against a lot when I teach, and I find that, one, the expectation of faculty to teach the databases is very strong. Secondly, that's what students expect, and a lot of times they just really do need articles to complete their assignment. So if they're not familiar with the library or with databases, they probably aren't going to get there on their own. So I try and make this balance really between addressing these larger issues that I would love to only teach about and kind of addressing the mechanics of searching and using the library so that students aren't left behind in doing that. So I find it really difficult.
Well, and I think not just like demoing the databases, but talking about why the students are supposed to use a library in the first place is a conversation about capitalism, right? Because the conversation becomes like the reason we're here is not because like we're trying to compete with Google and like make you learn a new way to search, right? The reason that we're here is that some information costs money and you already paid to get access to that information, right? And so that's why we're asking you to search in this different way and use these platforms. And so I think that they understand that, and then they understand why they're here in the first place. And like, I think showing search strategies is one thing, but I don't spend a lot of time on the data. I spend as little time as possible demoing. I mean, I just don't think that it's very exciting. Yeah.
So I think with the loaded examples thing that I mentioned, but also if we maybe took the database actually as a object of study itself, a text, and then ask students also, so what are we not seeing here? Because to me, that's one of the things that we could do in a critical information literacy perspective, is to have students understand that information emerges out of systems, and certain information doesn't emerge out of systems. And so if we took the database as a text to be interrogated as opposed to a tool to be demonstrated, we can actually teach the database in the way the faculty and the student is expecting, because it looks like a database discussion, but it's actually an interrogation of information structures.
Thank you all. Thank you.